You can start.
Hello, assalamu alaikum, and welcome to our 32nd book discussion. My name is Awais Khan. We are very happy to have Dr. Abdullah Al-Arian with us today to speak about his most recent publication. Let me first begin by introducing Dr. Abdullah Al-Arian, and we are planning on having a critical conversation about his new publication. So I would remind all of the viewers to send their questions through the appropriate mediums online, and we will filter those, feed those to Dr. Al-Arian during the course of our conversation. Dr. Al-Arian is an associate professor of history at Georgetown University School of Foreign Service in Qatar. He received his doctorate from Georgetown University and his master's degree from LSE. He works on the Muslim Brotherhood and Islamist movements in the Middle East. His most recent publication is Answering the Call, Popular Islamic Activism in Sadat, Egypt, which was published by Oxford University Press in 2014. He is also an editor for Jadaliyya Online. He had a number of publications, but his latest one, which is the topic of our conversation today, is Football in the Middle East, State, Society, and the Beautiful Game. Welcome, Dr. Abdullah.
Thank you so much. It's very good to be with you.
Thank you so much. I would also want to introduce our director at CIGA, Dr. Al-Arian, who needs no introduction, but he was himself a tenured professor in the United States. Currently, he is the director of the Center for Islam and Global Affairs at Sabat University in Istanbul. He himself is well published on many different topics. Specifically, his work pertains to U.S. foreign policy and geopolitics in the Middle East. Dr. Sami, welcome you as well.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Awais, and thank you, Abdullah, for being here. First of all, congratulations on your book and on your son. Very excited. Can you tell us at the beginning how the idea came about? Writing about football. We understand there is, of course, the World Cup coming up in Qatar, and you teach at the Georgetown campus in Qatar. But how did the idea come about, and what is the real reason behind it, and what are you trying to cover in that book?
Yeah, I mean, I think, this is a long-term project that's been going on for about 3 years that was led by the Center for International and Regional Studies, which is a research center here based at Georgetown in Qatar. And, as they take on various projects within the center, there was a conversation about kind of, what are some of the important discussions to be had around not just the World Cup, but even kind of thinking beyond this one event, this momentous event. Of course, the entire eyes of the world will be on Qatar in just a few weeks' time. We're already starting to see, I think, the excitement, as well as the many different questions about, the implications of having this tournament here. It's been a long time in the making. Qatar won the bid to host the World Cup back in 2010. So this is a 12-year process of trying to get the country ready. And it's obviously opened it up to so many different questions about, the capacity building, about migrant labor conditions, about the question of football history and culture, not just in Qatar, but in the region, and about so many other kinds of topics. And I think, approaching this question from a research perspective for scholars really provided an opportunity to look at kind of deeper issues, ones having to do with history, in terms of thinking about the legacy of football as not just a sport or a game, but really as a set of institutions when we think about kind of the importance from an economic, financial perspective in many countries in the region, when we think about the colonial legacies of the game that go back over a century, when we think about also the questions around globalization and the way that the game or the sport has been implicated now more in terms of the economic relations between countries, and even expending influence of various states and governments. And so there's so many different elements to these to this question of football that I think makes it ripe for further investigation. And so I served as editor of the volume, but really the work was done by a tremendous collection of scholars. There were about 13 scholars that are represented in this book, all of whom have played a role in terms of researching specific, unique questions that are very much in line with the field work that they've done, with the regions that they hail from, and also with their disciplinary expertise. So people coming from backgrounds in history, sociology, politics, looking at media studies as well. And so there are also questions having to do with not just the World Cup itself, but even kind of thinking more long-term about the evolution of football. And so for me, the point of interest is not just because I'm a big fan of the game and have been watching the World Cup, all the way going back to my childhood, but also thinking about, what it means for the region to be finally playing host to a tournament that we don't often associate with the Middle East, with the Arab world, with the Islamic world. And so I think in that sense, there was definitely an intersection between my kind of cultural interest in football as a game, as a fan, of the game, but also in terms of my own past research as someone who looks at social movements, looks at the kind of the tensions between states and societies in the Middle East. I've looked at it obviously in the past through my study of Islamic social movements, being there kind of on the forefront of a number of the changes that were taking place during the Arab uprisings just a decade ago, and seeing the influence of different cultural forms, but especially football, when we think about the role that various fan groups like the Ultras in Egypt and more recently in Algeria and across the region really have mobilized in a way that was only possible because they come from football fandom. And it's much easier to collectivize and mobilize from that background as opposed to having your own political party in an environment that doesn't allow it. And so in that sense, I think we've seen football play a much more meaningful role in political mobilization. And on the other side, of course, we see that the states in the region have tried, very aggressively to monopolize control of the game and try to manipulate it and instrumentalize it in a way that is beneficial to their own interests. And we see that, of course, quite recently with the Sisi regime in Egypt, but also in terms of how various other governments across the region have tried to deploy their own interests in football. Saudi Arabia just became the latest owner of a Premier League club in England, having just purchased Newcastle United. And so this, of course, has opened up so many questions about the concept of sports washing, the idea of trying to leverage your sporting interests to try to deflect attention away from some of the more abusive or problematic practices and policies. And I think, this is another angle for the conversation that's been had around football in the region recently.
Very well. Let me just, before I turn it over to Awais, ask you about what do you think the most important findings or ideas that this volume brought about to our understanding of the role of the football in the region? You talked about Egypt. You mentioned, lots about Egypt and in the volume, Algeria, the GCC countries like Qatar, particularly Qatar. Also Iran and Turkey. You involved many societies. So what do you think the most important ones related to football and society? The subtitle here is State Society and the Beautiful Game. So what do you think should be highlighted in our discussion?
Yeah, I mean, I think for one thing is the idea that football does have a long and very rich legacy in history in this region. So for me, of course, I'm a little bit partial because I come from a background as a historian, as someone who really appreciates the idea of trying to trace things back to their roots. And one of the first reactions that we heard when Qatar was awarded the World Cup is this idea that, well, this region doesn't really have a footballing history, and what has it done to actually earn the right or to deserve the right to host such a massive tournament that's going to have the entire eyes of the world on it. And again, I mean, a lot of this comes from a position of completely erasing the history of the game and the way that it's spread. And so, you know, the first chapter actually in the book looks specifically at the question of the Egyptian League and the way that it formed. And a number of other chapters also represent the question of history and the idea that football is a game that was very much deeply enmeshed in colonial authority, and the idea that British and French officials were introducing cultural activities in part to try to discipline subjects within the societies and the nations that they colonized. But then what happens over time, of course, is like with most things that are introduced through the colonial experience, is that it then becomes something that is internalized by the local population, and they actually use it as a means of empowerment. And so the formation of the Egyptian League, for instance, was very much about a struggle between, on the one hand, local elites, colonial officials, people who were founding the clubs themselves, the royal family, of course, which played a role in Egypt, and then, of course, nationalist leaders and business elites. And so all of the intersection of these various actors, in some ways, I think, tells us that there's the story of kind of the emergence of the nation itself in these kinds of stories. And so football helps illuminate aspects of that history that we don't often hear. And when we fast forward a little bit, we can see that in a number of countries, that football was also being used as a means of having experience in terms of political expression, right? So in Sudan, for instance, the development of the Sudanese League became a means for the practice of politics at a time when political parties were not allowed to serve their own populations because of the colonial presence. Or in the case of Jordan, for instance, where it was asserted on the part of the monarchy to try to legitimize the Hashemite monarchs through football tournaments and these kinds of things. Or in the case of Algeria in the 1950s, when the FLN, which was, of course, the revolutionary movement fighting for independence from France, formed a team in exile that traveled the world to try to spread the word about the Algerian Revolution and try to solicit support, and even raised funds using some of the friendly matches that it was playing in different countries. And then, of course, going back to Egypt, when Gamal Abdel Nasser comes to power as part of the Free Officers Revolution, that he also saw the importance of football. And so he ends up helping to create the entire African, the Confederation for African nations. And ends up
the Confederation tournament.
Yes, exactly. So the African Cup of Nations was spearheaded in large part by Egypt. It ends up winning the first two editions of that tournament. And then later on, of course, he becomes the honorary president of an Ahli football club, which is one of the more popular clubs in Cairo. And a lot of the famous players from that time in the 1960s were receiving military honors to try to show this kind of relationship between the armed forces in Egypt and something as popular as football. So states try to kind of use the power that the game has, the way that it captures the imagination of these societies. And then more recently, I think we see yet another wave of popular mobilizations. So things having to do with the challenges that women face in Iran, which is something I'm sure many of us are following nowadays. The fact that they were not permitted to enter stadiums. And so there's been a campaign to allow women in Iran to be fans in attendance at matches. Or when we think about the BDS movement in Palestine and the fact that because of the power that football has, it's seen as an important site potentially to stand with the cause and with the solidarity for Palestinians suffering from Israeli apartheid and occupation. And so there's been kind of attempts to lobby teams like the Argentina national team, which has twice now in the last few years canceled friendly matches against the Israeli national team, in part because of the pressure of activists as well. And so these are moments that end up being as kind of opportunities to shed light on important topics. And so all of these are, by the way, themes that are explored in different chapters in the book. So of course, I can only do so much in terms of doing justice to the authors here. So I do hope that everyone listening will go check out the wonderful contributions from the many scholars who contributed to the book.
Very well, thank you, Owais.
Thank you so much for that very broad stroke kind of survey of what the volume adds Sorry, I have a cold. I wanted to ask you to take us back to kind of the origins of football in the Middle East, to try to give us kind of background. I know that the volume tries to do this from many different perspectives, but you yourself being a historian, maybe you can tell us what motivated colonists to share the game. Maybe share might be a generous word, but what motivated the colonists to bring football to colonies, where colonies were supposed to be places where they extract wealth from? Why do this cultural engagement?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a really important question. I think the major motivation on the part of colonial officials to try to introduce, and again, in here, when we're not just even talking about football, you can see the similar kinds of examples across different kinds of cultural forms. But the idea, if we think about, for instance, the French having a civilizing mission, or even the British introducing a kind of modernization project for all of the societies that they colonized, that there was a sense of trying to create, and again, I'm quoting here, the phrase that was used is properly obedient individuals. And so this meant being subject to colonial education, which is the education in modern sciences, in European languages, in modes of social, political, and economic organization. And physical fitness played a role in that, right? That if you're trying to create, a new class of local elites that are meant to serve the colonial interests, you want them to speak your language and you want them to think as you do. And part of that is also introducing certain cultural forms. And the thing about football, and Ibrahim al-Hudaybi, who wrote this first chapter about Egypt, does a really excellent job of kind of showing also the transition from what he calls play to game, right? That playing is a kind of free-spirited event in which you're just playing a kind of a sport without necessarily learning the structure or the rules, or knowing, what the kind of boundaries are for how the actual game is played. But once it gets institutionalized with rules and structures, that this is also part of disciplining a population by putting it subject to the kinds of bounds around which a game is organized. And then add to that, of course, the officials that are organizing matches, organizing tournaments, and now all of a sudden you've created a massive infrastructure, in this case over something that's a sport, but you can imagine how that would translate into so many other avenues in life. And of course, on top of that, the physical fitness, being regimented, being disciplined, having the kinds of structures that are meant to create a certain kind of class. And again, I think it's also important to note that this was limited in terms of only a certain elite who was exposed to these sports. And then over time, of course, that gets diffused down to other parts of society. And then over time, yeah, go ahead.
Can I ask, was there any opposition by, say, the ulama class?
Always, your sound is very weak. We can hardly hear you. Sorry.
I'm really sorry. I don't know how to.
I heard the question. I mean, as far as the opposition from within society, I mean, there certainly was always suspicion of, of among certain segments of society. As you mentioned, the ulama classes tended to be a little bit more hesitant to embrace cultural forms of any kind, whether we're talking about, music or theater or sports, games, as either being a way, a kind of distraction from the cause of national liberation, or perhaps being seen as innovative to the point of adopting cultural forms that are coming from other societies. But I think over time, as we know, of course, that those end up becoming losing battles. And in part, it's because I think there has to be an acknowledgement that when we talk about the imposition of kind of colonial practices, that we can't see it as a unidirectional phenomenon, that we have to kind of see it as a kind of a two-way street, right? That there's also a kind of talking back in the ways in which the game ends up evolving and becomes localized, right? So it develops different practices, different rules. And I think we see that with sports generally globally. I mean, we see it, for instance, when we think about the global appeal of cricket in all of the former British colonies, and the way that even that game kind of takes different directions and becomes a source of indigenous mobilization and empowerment, and even kind of contributing their own practices to the game. I think we see that with football, which is a game that many countries lay claim to, but no one can actually say that they can monopolize because of the various forms and shapes that it takes within different societies.
Okay, I wanted to tell us about how you have a story about the Iraqi national team when they won the Asian Cup, and how Bush, the president at the time, was trying to exploit that. What is the point that he was trying to exploit?
Yeah, so this was actually from the 2004 Olympics. So during the Olympic Games, and here we're talking just barely a year and a half probably since the US-led invasion of Iraq, which of course laid a lot of devastated the country in terms of just the sheer humanitarian toll that it took. And so there was a big surprise in the fact that the Iraqi national team that competed in football in the Olympic Games won some really impressive matches in the initial stages, and then it made it into the kind of the knockout phase of the tournament, where it ends up in a semifinal match. And so as soon as that momentum kind of really took off, there was a reaction on the part of the George W. Bush administration within the US, which was battling a lot of critique because it had, over a year earlier had declared victory in Iraq, and now all of a sudden it was mired in an occupation that it was not really prepared for, and it was overseeing, tremendous violence within the country along sectarian lines, and a perception that the U.S. occupation was more and more illegitimate with every passing day, because it was simply unable to find the partners that it sought locally to be able to hand power to. And so one of the things that the Bush administration did was try to seize on this kind of, glimmer of hope or success of the Iraqi football team to say, this is something we should take credit for as the United States. And so he actually used it in his re-election campaign in 2004. Of course, that was the year he was up for his second term. The election was in November, but as early as kind of July and August, there was already an attempt to capitalize on that. And so he put, Bush mentioned this in several of his speeches and his radio addresses. And then there were even television advertisements in which, the US declared, there are too fewer terrorist nations at this year's Olympics, and instead we have two more free nations in Afghanistan and Iraq. And they had pictures emblazoned across the screen of the Iraqi national football team. And there were even discussions at the time that if the team won and made it to the gold medal match, that Bush was even considering flying to Athens, where the games were being held, to be in attendance. Now, remember, this is usually an honor that's reserved for the president of the country, not the president of an occupying power, but it kind of goes to show the extent to which the US was very keen on exploiting that moment in a way that would actually affirm its own occupation in Iraq. And of course, the Iraqi team ended up losing, so we didn't end up seeing what would have happened if they made it to the final match. But there were even discussions that they wanted the Iraqi national team to be also waving the Afghanistan flag, right? So this was also a way of kind of combining the two occupations by saying, here's the US as this force of good, which is, vicariously winning gold medals through the countries that it has invaded. And so I think, there's certainly a sense of exploitativeness that we see from that incident.
So because of the massive popularity of the game, politicians try to exploit that, certainly. You make that in your chapter about Egypt and others. Are there any other examples you can cite, and combine that also with the fact people were very surprised when Qatar was awarded this. Qatar is a very tiny nation, about a couple of million people. That includes even the people who are not citizens of the country. And yet it was awarded the most prized, the most important event in sports, which comes every 4 years. Were there any politics? Did you explore that in the book behind this? And if not, what would have been because if you look at the history of the game, usually it's big nations. I think the smallest nation probably would have been South Africa back in 2010. But other than that, most nations who hosted the World Cup would have been nations either with a demonstrated history of winning the game or at least competing at the highest levels, or big nations like the United States, several million people, even though they never advanced beyond maybe the knockout stage of 16. Nevertheless, Qatar was prized a choice, and there were a lot of talk about Qatar, bribing itself into this. Of course, that was never proven. However, what would be what did you explore in this book about all these issues?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to untangle here. I think, in terms of the chapter that you referred to first, I mean, that one is looking specifically at football as a means of legitimizing regimes, legitimizing states. So we see a lot of examples in this region in particular that I point to. I mean, the Iraq US example is just one in terms of trying to legitimize a very unique kind of military occupation. But in general, I think, we can see that most authoritarian states in this region have tried to deploy their interest in football as a way of legitimizing themselves. But what I argue is that it's not just legitimacy for its own sake. It's usually even more narrowly conceived than that. And so one of the examples that I usually bring in is what happened in 2009 when Egypt and Algeria were fighting for one last spot at the 2010 World Cup. They ended up going to a sudden death kind of playoff match that had to be held at a neutral site. So it was held in Sudan. But there were all kinds of accusations that the Egyptian fans were attacking the Algerian team. They pelted the bus with rocks, injuring some people. And of course, over the period of the days leading up to that match, there was an incredibly hostile and kind of violent atmosphere within Egyptian society against Algeria. That was an incredibly kind of xenophobic, anti-Algerian kind of moment of hysteria, really. And again, we know fan violence is a very unfortunate and tragic part of the game. It's not something that's unique to this case or any case. But what was unique about this case is that most of that inflammatory language was actually very closely coordinated by the state. That we saw the Egyptian regime have a very direct hand in trying to mobilize Egyptian society against Algeria, stoking the flames of hatred and anger. We see it with the constant barrage of media coverage, the radio stations, all the state media was enlisted in a very anti-Algerian sentiment. In the end, Algeria won, and so they ended up actually advancing to the 2010 World Cup. But what the Egyptian state was trying to do at the time that seemed pretty evident is the fact that they were trying to legitimize the accession potentially of Gamal Mubarak to take over from his father, right? So Hosni Mubarak was in the process of trying to position his son to take over. His son doesn't come from a military background, so it was a very hard pitch. It was a hard sell to try to get Egyptians to, for the first time, accept a non-military, leader. And so it's interesting that the language, the imagery, all of the symbols that were being used was almost like, Gamal Mubarak was this general leading his nation to war, except the war was on the football field and not an actual battlefield. And so you see it in the images, the language that was used. And so this was a very clear attempt to try and legitimize a hereditary succession project and using football to do it. Now we see a number of other examples. I'll just go very quickly because I know we will want to make sure to talk about some of the other questions. But for instance, we look at what the United Arab Emirates has been doing, having invested massive funds into its ownership of Manchester City Football Club in England. It's turned around its entire fortunes. Manchester City has been by far the most dominant team we've seen in the last decade or so in England. But what's interesting is that in addition to investing in the team, it's invested in the city of Manchester, creating massive jobs, a number of jobs and in housing projects and things along those lines, to the point where now Manchester City actually has a very significant role within British politics, that the board members of the club could do things like, for instance, as The Guardian has reported on a number of occasions, that they can even lobby the British government to do things like investigate opposition movements within the Arab world. And so they pressured the British government to investigate the Muslim Brotherhood, to look at various.
Wait. Can you repeat and expound on that a bit?
Yeah,
They
so
went from being an owner of a football club into trying to force a government to outlaw certain groups within the Middle East. Is that what you just said?
Well, this is what's been reported, at least in terms of who the main figures were that were part of this lobbying project. And many of them were board members. So they're people who on one capacity serve as, professional members of a football club, but then in another capacity are attempting to influence or shape British policy toward, again, opposition movements. And again, we're talking about in the context of the Arab uprisings and the counter-revolutions and all of the events that we've seen unfold over the last decade. And so again, all of this has been reported in a number of outlets, but The Guardian in particular has written on it on several occasions. And so again, it's not that surprising, because we tend to think of sports and politics as somehow these spheres that are completely separate, when in fact they're totally intermixed, and not just because the common denominator here is obviously having tremendous economic influence, right? The idea of being able to invest massive amounts of money in a club, in a city, in a government. There were questions about arms deals that were being threatened to be pulled had the government of Britain not pursued its investigation, which it ultimately did end up launching that review. And so there are other kinds of ways. I mean, one of the other stories I tell has to do with Qatar's response to the blockade in 2017. Qatar, of course, was facing tremendous regional and even international isolation. And that was, of course, the exact same summer that the Qatari-owned club in Paris Saint-Germain, ended up buying Neymar for an unprecedented transfer fee, right? So $300 million or 300 million euros from the perspective of football is an incredible amount for a player. But for a state to invest this as a means of ending its isolation, you can argue is a bargain, right? That this was the kind of discussion that was being had as far as, what does it mean to be investing this way? Now, Neymar, of course, for the last 5 years has been basically, in addition to being, one of the world's best talents and someone who is very visible in terms of media, but has also been very much part of the Qatar 2022 campaign. You see him, his image on billboards, you see him in all of the advertisements. And so there's a sense that investing in football is also a means of kind of deflecting or thwarting some of the threats to isolation that we've seen here. And then just to go to your very last question, as far as, what does it mean for the World Cup itself? Obviously, there were a lot of questions, I think, that came up in 2010. It was a very unusual result to have, like you said, a very small country and one that hadn't competed previously, even in the tournament, to all of a sudden be the host of it. Now, on the other side, I think the argument that was being made is that the Qatar World Cup was meant to represent the region, right? So all of the discussions and the conversation was that this was a World Cup for the Middle East. This was a World Cup for Muslim societies, right? It was the first Muslim country, the first Arab country, the first Middle Eastern country that was going to be hosting this tournament. And so that this was about Qatar, but it was about a lot more than that, theoretically. And to a certain extent, I mean, I think we can see signs of that, right? So for instance, in 4 years, when the World Cup is held in North America and the US and Canada and Mexico, how easy would it be for, citizens of Muslim majority or Arab countries to be able to go and attend the World Cup there, right? So we think about fans coming from Iran, fans coming from Iraq, from, Jordan, Morocco, Tunisia, the last two, of course, being countries that are actually qualified here. Iran, of course, has qualified. The US is a country that just recently had something called a Muslim ban, right? That actually outright explicitly banned people from coming from these countries. And so the idea of a Qatar World Cup in many ways was opening the game and opening this occasion for people who otherwise may not be able to experience it, given all of the limitations that we know about travel to Europe, to North America, and so forth. And partly also as a kind of a cultural expression, right? That this was going to open the entire region up to being explored, for tourism, for cultural exchange. Now, we know, of course, that these mega events, they sort of spell out these things in theory, but of course, it's much difficult to imagine kind of how this plays out in practice, right? Is this really a cultural exchange, or is it simply trying to kind of recreate the same event in just a different location? Is it something that's actually being cooked up by, by FIFA, by consultants from different, consulting firms based in London and New York and Paris and so forth? And so there's also an element of Qatar having to adapt to some of the expectations, right? I mean, one of the big questions, for instance, having to do with, permitting the sale of alcohol in a country where alcohol is severely restricted. And of course, there's been a lot of reporting recently about the fact that in order to accommodate all of the visiting fans who are accustomed to enjoying their football in a certain way, that a lot of those kinds of restrictions had to be lifted in a way that would be more accommodating to those fans, as opposed to saying, we're going to maintain our own practices and our own laws in the same way, irrespective of the conditions. And so these are the kinds of negotiations that have been going on for well over a decade now, in terms of what is this going to look like. I mean, there's fans who are also upset about the fact that this is happening in the wintertime, right? At least a tournament that has always been held in the summer. It's never been held outside of the summer months, that now has to accommodate, all of the scheduling. So in the US, for instance, this is the prime time for the NFL season. So the broadcasters are nervous that they're not going to get the same ratings while NFL games are happening. In Europe, you have to suspend all of the leagues at a time when, in November, December, the leagues are finally picking up steam, and you end up with some of the most important matches. And so the idea of having to basically turn the entire schedule upside down was another one of the criticisms. But I mean, I think it's interesting, given what we've seen with the summer weather conditions, not just, of course, in a place like Qatar, where we know the temperatures reach kind of, really insane and unsafe temperatures. But I think we've seen that everywhere recently, right? In this past summer, the massive heat waves in Europe, in North America, and other places open serious questions about whether environmentally having a summer World Cup in the future is going to really be feasible, given what we're seeing in terms of climate change and things of that. So in some ways, I think the Qatar World Cup is opening up a lot more questions that will be there long after this tournament is held here.
Does that mean we're going to see a lot of drunk people on the streets? Is that plausible?
There's definitely discussions about kind of ways to regulate, people through fan zones and things along those lines. But ultimately, I think the idea is to try to accommodate, the hundreds of thousands of fans that are visiting. But perhaps, within certain kinds of limits. We don't know exactly what those will be. I think, again, a lot of this we're going to only discover as the days pass and we see them in practice, as opposed to having any sense of what the actual policies are from now.
Right. Okay. Awais?
Yeah, I really have to apologize about my audio. I don't know why
you sound fine now. Now you're okay.
For the last 2 minutes, I've been trying to switch my device to cover the audio problem, but I guess it's better now.
Yeah.
One of the things I liked about the book, Abdullah, was how, as you said, you don't look at football just as this thing that's separate from politics. And one of the ways that, neoliberal political power kind of asserts itself globally is to try to show that there are certain aspects of human life which are apolitical. I mean, the classic civic political divide, But I think the book really brings out how football or any kind of mega sport, which has a kind of universal following, is very complicated, right? So it has all of these political implications. So could you talk a little bit more about how studying football in particular kind of brings out the political nature of things that are typical, what liberals would like us to believe are not political. But then in doing so, it becomes a site for undermining the very legitimacy of liberal controls. So in humanitarian cases, for instance, we see the same thing. Like humanitarian aid is supposed to be this neutral zone where, just for the sake of people in need, we should be able to aid and help people. But it's precisely in those areas where the political contestation becomes the most acute. Recently, we saw it in terms of economics. I mean, now, oligarchs are being, sanctioned, and full-on countries are being barred. So economy obviously isn't a neutral thing anymore. So could you please kind of fill us in on that?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's an interesting question. I think the way that we tend to think about sports, like you said, is they exist in this kind of exceptional sphere, right? That they exist kind of outside and above, and and we see it in all of the FIFA charter, the Olympic charter, that competition is kind of this pure space in which politics or partisanship of any kind should not enter. And of course, all of us know that that's never the case, right? And in fact, we tend to be very particular about when we think something is political and when we think something is apolitical. But I think, for those of us observing this, the processes involved, we would say that it's always political, right? That there's never really an ability to separate those things out, in part because sports, like everything else that we're talking about in terms of the political sphere, is about allocation of power and resources, right? That this is ultimately about kind of the balancing act between, sports and let's just say football, for the sake of this discussion, as a cultural form that has universal appeal, right? So it exists everywhere in the world. No one country or one government or one entity or institution, even FIFA itself, can claim to have control over the game, how it's managed, how it's played, how it's experienced. So there's this idea that there's also kind of a collectivist values, right? That football in its pure form kind of represents this aesthetically, beautiful game that is, based on the kind of the interaction of the players on the field. And it kind of institutes the idea that you have to have an entire team playing as one, playing together, right? So there's something very kind of communal and collectivist about the way that football is experienced, especially when we move beyond kind of the clubs and the kind of the high-end version of the game. But when we think about the way that it exists in various neighborhoods and various cities and communities, and the way that it kind of becomes a site for bonding, a site for, mixing of or kind of collecting of people together and so forth. And so I think what ends up happening quite often is, like with most things that people can find, let's just say kind of certain forces or actors can find benefit from for themselves, that it ends up becoming commodified. And so what we've seen, especially with football, I would say over the last, several decades, but probably even going back earlier, is the mass commodification of the game, right? The idea that now you can use it to turn massive profits. You can use it to turn it into an economic branding exercise, or a national branding exercise, a political exercise of branding. And as a result, I think we're seeing, again, I mean, it's interesting that there's so much scrutiny of the question of state-owned football clubs, but the oligarchs, as you mentioned before, receive far less attention, right? So when Russian billionaires or American billionaires were buying European clubs long before Gulf states were doing the same thing. And so what we're seeing now, in fact, is in some ways kind of the logical endpoint of a process that has been at work for a very long time. And the idea of expending tremendous sums of money to try to impact the experience that we all have with the game. And I think that in some ways is endemic in terms of, like you said, kind of anything that captures as much eyes as something like a World Cup is going to be ripe for a number of different forces, whether we're talking about kind of the neoliberal economic flows, right? The idea of trying to find a way to commodify it so that it becomes this experiential and like commodity that can be manipulated in various ways to pursue certain goals, or whether we think about it purely in terms of the narrow political interests of states that are trying to kind of acquire not just something like a hosting right, but even kind of to be associated with it in any way. So there's definitely, I think, a way to look at this even more broadly from the Middle East, and just seeing it as kind of a phenomenon in terms of how the globalization of the game. And as you said, I think earlier, you mentioned the idea of the parallels with humanitarian aid. And in fact, we actually have a really fantastic chapter in in the volume called Refugees in Football in the Global and Middle East Context, which actually looks at the way that football itself has been deployed as a means of trying to deal with the global refugee conflict, right? And so you have all of these very well-meaning, programs from various institutions, even football clubs get involved, the United Nations, refugee projects, different governments that are trying to kind of promote football as a means of dealing with the refugee issue, specifically with children. But at the same time, to what extent are a lot of these kind of programs and projects in some ways just playing into not addressing the core of the problem, right? The essence of the problem, that they just become kind of a way to perpetuate the status quo as it is in terms of not addressing the actual causes of the refugee crisis, which of course is seen as kind of a high level. This is very political. It's about, geopolitics. It's about war and conflict, and football can't really address those issues. So at the very least, we offer some relief programs as opposed to trying to kind of get to the essence of what the core of the problems are. And I think this is also where it kind of is seen as coming up short, right? That it's not there to actually be able to solve problems. It's just there as a momentary relief, as a distraction, as something that is also in some ways implicated in the very issues, right? If we're thinking about, refugees from conflict, but also from climate change, from economic dislocation, and to what extent are the same neoliberal forces that are enacting these humanitarian projects also responsible for creating some of the crises in the first place, right? They're implicated in that as well. And I think for that reason, there's a much more complex legacy there in terms of how, there tends to be kind of an inability, or at least a shortcoming of the use of sort of football as humanitarian aid, or football as peacemaking even, in terms of being able to address the core issues that are really kind of left only to the political sphere to be dealt with.
Something that caught my eye reading through the different chapters is that there are a lot of references to Palestine. You have in one chapter titled "Playing in the Terrible Periphery," talking about Palestinians in Lebanon and how they are being deprived actually of becoming professional players. And then, of course, you talked about the refugee, which I would like you actually to expound on it a bit. And then you talk about, of course, the role of BDS. And then you talk also, there is a chapter about the hierarchy of Algeria and its relationship. And also you have the one about Chile. So if you can put in perspective the impact of Palestine on this game, how profound or how deep is it? And there's a lot, obviously, each one is from a different perspective. Perhaps you can talk about each separately or combine them as a whole. And then you have this chapter on refugees and the game. And perhaps you talked a bit, you referred to it a bit here, but perhaps you can tell us what is the conclusion, particularly within what is termed in the chapter as the SDP program, which has to do with the development and progress, or whatever the term refers to, for refugees. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, as far as thinking about the question of Palestine in particular, obviously, I think it's a very unique case for a number of reasons. One of which, of course, is that so much of the emphasis on studying, the globalization of sports happens through the lens of nation states, right? So now states have become basically by default the leading or primary actors in terms of the regulation of the game, right? So even organizations like the Olympic Committee or FIFA or any kind of regional or international body governing sports is ultimately at the mercy of the members, right? That are actually paying for the infrastructure and the buildup of the game, right? And the more powerful states tend to influence those organizations more powerfully, or have much more of a direct impact. And so in the case of Palestinians, of course, you're talking about a stateless population that is existing in a kind of a settler colonial context that has been, kind of stripped of its rights, both within its indigenous homeland in Palestine, but also in a context in which they live as refugees. Of course, the Lebanese context, I think, is most would agree that the situation of refugees, of Palestinian refugees in Lebanon, is more extreme than in any other context, right? More so than in Syria or in Iraq or Jordan or Egypt. And so for that reason alone, I think this was a very ripe topic for investigation that a scholar who was based at AUB at the time, Daniel Reisha, who wrote about this for the volume, really explores the ways that the broader discrimination within Lebanese society against Palestinian refugees manifests in the realm of football. And so many people listening, for instance, will probably be aware that there's 40-something professions in Lebanon that Palestinians are not allowed to hold, right? So they're not allowed to be doctors just by virtue of being Palestinian. They're not allowed to be a number of other professions. But how many people would know that Palestinians are also not allowed to be goalkeepers? Because apparently this was a rule that was passed, some time ago, where the Lebanese league, the football league, was concerned about the number of Palestinians who were making it onto the various teams, despite the fact that many of them were coming from incredibly disadvantaged backgrounds, right? That they're learning the game in refugee camps. They don't have access to proper fields or equipment, and yet they were still emerging as kind of effective, especially in the position of goalkeeper at one point. And so the Lebanese league simply passed a rule in which they barred them from that position, and then even put a quota on the number of Palestinian players that can play on Lebanese clubs. And this was meant to be a way to strengthen the Lebanese national team, which of course hasn't really been effective. But what it does is that it ends up, in what the author here calls the triple periphery. So he says, that they're not able to play in their league in the country that they're in. They're not able to join the national team there because, of course, they're not admitted as citizens. So even, Palestinians who are 3-4 generations living in camps in Lebanon are not allowed to even join the Lebanese national team. And then, of course, they're also not allowed to join the Palestinian national team because they're barred from entry to their own homeland, of course, as being refugees. And so when the national team of Palestine has to organize matches, they deal with a tremendous number of logistical issues, one of which is being able to find a place to meet. The refugees are not allowed back in. The ones who are living in Gaza especially, but even in the West Bank, are not able to leave quite often without very special permissions from the Israeli occupation. And so for that reason, you end up with a completely fractured experience for the Palestinian Football Club. And of course, this gets us into some of the various responses, which I think I spoke about earlier, which is the BDS movement's emphasis on the idea of looking at football as a site to continue to express protest against Israeli practices and human rights abuses, but especially because of the deprivation of Palestinians from being able to compete both locally, domestically, regionally, and of course, internationally. And so the BDS movement has singled out in some ways football as a place, and again, there's a chapter by another author here that deals specifically with that. But ultimately, I would say that even looking beyond the question of Palestine, but just the idea of the inequality that exists within football and the various kind of elements of control that exist from international bodies, from governments, is one of the major shortcomings in terms of this purported ideal, right, of the game as being kind of a site where, politics, we kind of leave it at the door and we just go and play the game. And of course, that's not exactly how things develop when we see the mass inequality, but especially on the question of refugees, right? The idea that these are people who are, or these are groups and populations that are undefended or unprotected, whose rights are not respected. And so, there are only a few examples. So for instance, I think at the last Olympics, there was an attempt to put together a team of refugees. So they weren't representing one country, but just simply representing people who have been displaced. But this is kind of a very, very early response that we still haven't seen kind of anything meaningful about kind of the integration of populations who have been displaced from their countries. And so a lot of these programs, while we can say that they're well-meaning, they're trying to think about ways to empower populations who are at incredibly vulnerable situations, incredibly disadvantaged, but that ultimately are not addressing any of the kind of the root causes in the way that we look at this. And so to just simply have a release valve, or just having kind of a humanitarian aid project that's just simply there to try and focus on short-term remedies, I think is I think we see in that other chapter mentions kind of in its conclusions, that we're still very far away from seeing within football specifically as a means of really kind of addressing the root causes of these crises.
Before Awais asks his next question, can you contrast the situation in Chile with that in Lebanon? And because these are two Palestinian communities, far apart, what would be the main difference? Is it because they had citizenship? Is it because they have settled? What would be the, first of all, talk about what's happening with football for Palestinians in Chile and contrast that what's happening in Lebanon, but give us the real reasons that you think are at play here.
Yeah, I mean, I think, the case of Palestinians in Chile is that it's a community that migrated a very long time ago, some of them going back to the Mandate era when Palestine was being controlled by British colonial officials. A lot of them left to seek, better economic opportunities in various places, and so there ended up being a community of Palestinians that established themselves in Chile. Over time, they even kind of integrated or assimilated into Chilean society to such a degree that they established a football club called Palestino. Palestino competes like in the main upper division of the Chilean National League. Of course, it's not only made up of Palestinian players, but it's interesting that it has that kind of legacy and that history. And so there have been opportunities for Palestinian Chileans to compete. I think they have won the league on more than one occasion. So they've been quite competitive. And, it really stems from the fact that Chilean society has integrated to the point of granting them the exact same rights, right? So that once you become established as a citizen, which is something that, of course, the Palestinian population in Lebanon is denied. But once you establish yourself as a citizen, then you have all the rights of citizenship, right? And again, there's also the sense that you're able to express yourself culturally and through your own kind of identity, both in terms of your adopted homeland as Chilean. And so, there have been, I think, documentaries that have been made about the Palestino football team. Many of its members, for instance, will speak only Spanish, but they still identify with their Palestinian heritage. And so there's been even attempts to have them linked up with Palestinian players abroad in order to try to compete as a national side, so that many of them can even compete under a Palestinian national football team. But because of many of the logistical challenges of being barred from entry and not being able to kind of bring the entire team together, especially the members of the team who are under occupation within Palestine, that those efforts have often fallen short. But certainly, I think the main distinction here is the fact that you're talking about a country that grants kind of full citizenship rights to communities that that might be refugees, as opposed to another one that draws very clear boundaries and doesn't grant them any of the same rights.
Of course, I'm not suggesting that Palestinians should get citizenship in Lebanon. I'm just trying to say that they could have had better accommodations in which they can still express themselves. Anyway, Awais?
Right. I wanted to ask if I wasn't able to see in the volume if there was exploration about football and religion. So one of the interesting factors of taking into consideration the role of football is in many ways the culture of football, right? So recently in Qatar, for instance, there was very controversy about whether or not LGBT plus fans will be able to have a safe space. Basically hinting at the fact that Qatar is some kind of Islamophobic country and therefore is not worthy of hosting such an international event. But that also means that the question of LGBT rights is a question that has taken center stage in the culture of football, to the point where it has been brought out as this point of tension. So another thing that I recently came across, and I think it's mentioned in your volume, is about women fans in Iran, right? So women fans going in Iran, whether or not they're allowed to attend sporting events, has also been an issue that is pressured by FIFA on Iran, right? That this kind of gender segregation is not part of football culture. So just generally, like, how does football integrate, how does football and football culture as a force of modernity, colonization, maybe even secularization in terms of body comportment and physical fitness, etc. How does that line up with the Middle East as a predominantly Muslim society and its relationship to football? If you can make some comments on that.
Yeah, no, I mean, these are all really important questions. So thank you. I mean, I think one of the things that we try to do first and foremost with, talking about these topics is first to shed the idea that there's anything exceptional about this region as being particularly averse to, to components or elements of football. I think anywhere you go, the game has to adapt and shift based on whatever the local preferences are, the local sensibilities, the way that kind of, and that's, I think, one of the beauties of the game, right, is that we tend to think of football largely through the countries in which it has had the most, success, whether it's like Brazil or, Germany and Italy and France. But I think when we kind of go beyond sort of just the actual competitive success and think about the culture around the game, and it tends to transform on the basis of kind of what the local sensibilities happen to be. And so in that sense, I think that there's always pressure that exists on, local societies from a game that is seen as kind of truly global and kind of belonging to everyone and so forth. And so I would say that kind of at the outset, and then once we get into the specifics about kind of what that actually means for this region, then yeah, I think there's very important questions that emerge as far as what does this mean for instance, the question of gender equity in football, right? The idea of not just even the question of female fans, but even female players, and being able to kind of promote the game among women throughout the Arab and Muslim worlds, but also about fan engagement and the idea of kind of creating a space whereby women can enter stadiums. And of course, that was a big issue in Iran. But I think, again, going back to that specific chapter, I think one of the more important contributions that it makes, in this case, the scholar Nikki Ahavan, who writes about this in terms of the media coverage of the topic, is the fact that, we tend to view things from the outside as being, this is about FIFA putting pressure on a state to try to, revise its practices. But I think what we see quite often, or what we might miss quite often if we don't look closely enough, is the fact that these are also internal processes in which the society itself is negotiating these issues, right? This isn't just about it being, sort of outside pressure, right? We tend to give so much credit to international bodies, the UN, FIFA, various Western-based human rights NGOs and organizations, without actually looking at the impact of what's happening within civil society, and the fact that you have a number of incredibly courageous activists who were trying to challenge these laws, and sometimes even to their own, to kind of incur violence to themselves. And so there's something to be said about the fact that we shouldn't assume that there's kind of one standard set of interpretations or practices that is sort of, that's the kind of normative response to all of these questions, but in fact that all of these things are open to negotiation within these societies, to the extent that we have to see these as a product of, the establishment of not modern nation states, that as much as we might say, this is a Muslim state, what does that really mean in the context of modern states, quite often that are structured around, post-colonial, political structures, legal structures, the inherited laws that come from that era, which, by the way, do things like regulate, sexual preference and orientation and so forth, that a lot of those are actually legacies of colonial rule that happen to have been adopted and embraced and internalized by post-colonial states. And so there's also that kind of tension, not just between tradition and modernity, as we often hear, but in terms of various types of modernities, right? The kind of the colonial one versus the attempts to try to even go back to some semblance of what's considered to be kind of, the authentic interpretation of the tradition, which is oftentimes seen as more of a reaction to modern pressures that we see in terms of human rights standards that are kind of considered universal and so forth. So again, I think there's a lot more kind of complexity in the way that these questions are being handled internally within a number of these contexts than what we often see covered in terms of the more superficial surface level press coverage. But I do think that there are fair questions to be asked, certainly based on kind of, people will comment, for instance, on what football fans coming to the World Cup may or may not experience in terms of discrimination on the basis of things that exist in Qatari law, right? In sort of just what the state has officially had on its books, maybe for decades or since the founding of the state. But I think, you look a little bit deeper and you see that the lived experience of people within society does not reflect, what the letter of the law might state, because states are obviously a negotiation between the structures of power that exist and the kind of lived everyday experience that's there in terms of the negotiation of these issues, which is why there seems to be an incongruence between how these things are actually being talked about externally versus how they're being negotiated and managed and navigated internally. And so again, that's sort of where I would also kind of come down on those issues, is to say, it's more productive to look at kind of how these things are being managed internally versus, just what might exist on the surface.
Thank you so much for that answer. I wanted to also ask you one last thing about, in regards to Turkey. So Mr. Ozil, I don't know if you followed this story, but he was, I think he said something like, when we win, I don't know if it was particularly him, but when we win, it's like, I'm German, but when I lose,
I'm Turkish.
Yeah, and I think a lot of this kind of, some kind of subtle Islamophobia is experienced by players who are playing in European leagues. And then I think he made a decision to Turkey and then joined the Turkish team. I'm not really sure what happened after that, but could you speak about, the fan and player relationship, in football, and how Islamophobia actually is sometimes there, and then Mohamed Salah's thing in Liverpool, the chants around him that emerged, which were disturbing in some ways, and then I think a lot of people also found it, encouraging. So there's a lot of complicated feelings around him in England. So I guess Muslim players in Europe and the question of Islamophobia.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is also another one of those double-edged swords in a way, because on the one hand, you're talking about people projecting onto football the hope that integration is possible, that tolerance, that inter-religious or inter-communal or across kind of various nationalities that can all be seen as kind of in this harmonious atmosphere, right? And we think, for instance, about the last World Cup, right? The 2018 French side that won the World Cup for the second time in the country's history had players from across sub-Saharan Africa, North Africa, from a number of kind of former French colonies that were really sort of the heart and soul in a way, in terms of just the massive amounts of success that team enjoyed on the field. And certainly there's kind of a feel-good story there, right? The idea that, in a country that we often hear so much about the disproportionate economic inequality faced by immigrant communities, the massive amounts of racism, discrimination, the lack of tolerance for Islam in various capacities, that somehow the success of a football team can overcome all of that. And I think to a certain extent, maybe we can see this as a way of education for segments of society. Maybe there's something about kind of, extending an image of the country that is not, the one that exists in the minds of people like Le Pen and others, who kind of see this as like this violent imposition of other ethnicities and cultures. But at the same time, I think we oftentimes project too much onto those players and onto those images, right? That in the end, we're still talking about an incredibly small number of people that may symbolically represent something in terms of, a young French citizen from one of these different backgrounds who might kind of look and see themselves in the success of these players. But what does this mean? As Ozil said, after the German team performed badly, and he and one other player, both of them, interestingly enough, non-coincidentally, were the ones that were singled out, both of them, of course, being from other backgrounds, right? Coming, especially in his case, as a German of Turkish background, that were singled out in terms of their performances, that were seen as the cause of the failure of the French team. So I think it's important to see the flip side of that in some ways it can also embolden and reaffirm notions of, of kind of exclusionary, racist, Islamophobic rhetoric. And so the bottom line is, I don't think that football is necessarily going to be the site of dealing with much deeper social problems. If anything, it's more of a reflection or a mirror of the kinds of forces that are kind of, contending with one another within society, as opposed to kind of putting the pressure on it to be there to solve these issues, right? And in some ways, certainly that can be the case, especially I think when you have, players and people who are outspoken within the federation, but especially I think among those players and, especially the managers and officials who have to speak out much more aggressively when these kinds of incidents happen. I don't think we really saw that. There wasn't a kind of unified defense of Mesut Ozil from the rest of the German team, or from his manager, or from various other corners of the German Football Association. And so I think that's really where you need to start seeing the change, and the pressure shouldn't be on the players themselves who are in that kind of vulnerable, precarious position themselves, which of course in the end, sadly resulted in his very kind of early retirement from the national team at a time when he was still, quite young enough to continue to compete.
Right. Let me switch gears a bit here and talk about what you termed in one of the chapters as football and identity, particularly, I think, in Qatar or the Gulf as a whole, considering that, of course, football is becoming much more popular, and the local citizens may not be at the level of competing professionally. So there's a lot of other nationalities which are incorporated in the national teams. And then the other issue has to do with the accusation of labor conditions and labor exploitation, particularly in Qatar. There's a lot of many articles and many concern about that. Can you give us some remarks about what you termed as football and identity? How is that playing out? And what is the idea behind this? Is it just trying to win, or are there more deeper meanings in terms of integration within these societies, which are looked at as privileged societies with exceptional situation? And also, what has been done about these labor concerns? And was there any of the chapters trying to address that too?
Yeah, so I'll talk here about, I think, two of the chapters that are really fantastic contributions on both of these questions. The first is from a colleague based at Qatar University named Ross Griffin, who looks specifically at what he calls national identity performance in the Qatar team, in the Qatar national team. And it's interesting for a number of reasons. On the one hand, because I think, going back to Uwais's last question about, how do you make sense of these teams that are national teams, but that are made up of various ethnicities? And I think, people tend to assume that in the European experience, it's a very natural progression, right? That the idea that you have the legacy of colonialism that has now created a scenario or an environment wherein, you have multi-ethnic, multinational national teams, right? So people coming from various backgrounds. In the case of France, as we said, coming from Algerian or Tunisian background, or from Senegalese, or various other. So there's kind of something to be said about the fact that, well, we see this as kind of a natural progression that we don't necessarily question. But when we look at the situation in Gulf states, where citizenship is so much more heavily restricted, that anytime you have someone coming from a different national background, the assumption is, oh, well, they're simply buying talent. And so they're creating this hybrid team that is not in any way reflective of the society. And this chapter basically makes the case that the Qatar national team exists as kind of a very important exception to that. And in some ways, maybe a sign of things to come, that we have to actually look at what the Qatar national team has done. And again, we have to remember that this is a country that knew it was going to be competing in the World Cup in 2022 before anyone else, right? They had a 12-year head start in a way, because this is the first time that we've had that announcement so far in advance. They knew they were going to be hosting the games. And so what Qatar ended up doing, or at least the Football Association, the National kind of Football Federation here, is they created a football academy. They solicited kind of young talent, both internally as from Qatari players. And so there's kind of three separate categories here. Some who are kind of indigenous, native born Qataris citizens. There's others who were born here but may hail from elsewhere. And then there's, of course, immigrants or the children of immigrants, all of whom have been given citizenship over the course of their childhood. And of course, in order to be able to qualify, they have to start playing for the Qatar national team from a specific age. And so what this chapter examines is the demonstration of national identity. So how Qatari really are they, right? Is someone coming from a background in Sudan or Iraq or from South America really going to be integrated in the team and going to be considering themselves Qatari? And the evidence here is kind of surprising. And I think in some ways it's a result of a number of recent developments. But in particular, I think 2017 was a massive shift. It was a turning point, because the moment that the blockade impacts Qatar by having its neighbors from Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain and Egypt, all of them kind of trying to isolate Qatar, that you actually saw this kind of natural reaction on the part of both citizens as well as residents within the country, who kind of banded together in the face of this being cut off, from air traffic, from travel, from trade, and as a means of kind of asserting their own national identity. So you actually start to see a major demonstration of Qatari national identity, even on the part of players in the team who are posting things, tweeting things, photos, messages of support. We saw it also during the pandemic, when many of them were giving up some of their salaries in order to kind of deal with the crisis as it was unfolding. We saw it in terms of support for the state, but also support generally for a peaceful resolution to some of the conflicts in which Qatar kind of found itself in the middle of during the blockade. So there's definitely a sense that it created a situation, or fostered a certain kind of cohesion within the national team. And we've seen it in terms of success on the field. So I don't know if a lot of people know this, but Qatar is entering the 2022 World Cup as the champion of Asia, having just won the most recent version of the Asian Cup. And it actually played those games in the UAE at a time that the blockade was still happening, which meant the fans couldn't travel from here to attend those matches in large numbers. And so instead you had kind of yet another situation in which the team was very much, in a sense, isolated and under tremendous pressure in the environment that it was in. And yet it kind of pulled out some really impressive victories throughout the course of that tournament. It's performed very well in other competitions, including the FIFA Arab Cup, which is a first of its kind competition that was just played here last year. And so despite the fact that not a lot of people are expecting Qatar to do very much in the days ahead,
of course. What was the conclusion? Was the identity thing resolved in favor of having a multidimensional identity, or a combined or integrated? What was the conclusion?
Yeah, I mean, I think the idea that we're seeing identity performance happening in ways that we may not have previously anticipated or predicted, to the point where even I think some of the theoretical literature that exists, and again, I would encourage people to go and read the chapter where it's very clearly kind of laid out more than I can explain here. But I think, the literature is kind of falls short, because it doesn't take into account the local conditions and the circumstances here. And so in some ways, I think what this volume in general, and what this chapter in particular are trying to do, is to sort of push some of the theories forward, because so much of what we expect or anticipate in terms of applying theories that were made for other contexts, whether it's Europe or North America or South America, don't really apply or fit in here. But I know you also asked a question about the migrant labor issue, so I want to make sure to touch on that in the time that we have. And yeah, there is a chapter by a colleague of mine, Zahra Babar, who's a senior, staff at the Center for International and Regional Studies who's been conducting research on migrant labor in Qatar for, well over a decade, and who examined the campaign to kind of change the migrant labor conditions in Qatar and kind of came up with a number of really important conclusions as well on the basis of that kind of empirical research. And so one of the things that we see, of course, is that the criticism sometimes was very incongruous with the reality on the ground, especially in terms of as things were shifting. So for the past 12 years, we've been seeing more or less the same types of critiques being published, particularly in European media, that I think has initially raised some really crucial concerns and questions, right, about migrant labor conditions, about the kafala system in particular, but then I think has fallen flat in terms of its inability to get into much more detail about kind of what's really happening on the ground and what have been the shifts, the progressive shifts over time. So whereas the conditions may have existed in a certain way, 10 or 12 years ago, what are the kinds of changes internally that have happened? 2017, for instance, once again, is a really critical marker because this is when the blockade actually isolated Qatar to the point where there were a number of policy changes that completely transformed the kafala system as it's been in place for many, many decades. And in part, I think having Qatar separated from the rest of the GCC actually created an environment, and having the popularity of the state at the time also created an environment in which reforms that may have been more contentious in the past, both for regional and domestic reasons, were far less controversial. And so what we've seen, for instance, is a complete change in the structure of the kafala system to the point where the idea that workers could not change their employers or change their employment without the permission of their employers was removed. And so now workers could actually change jobs where there were more avenues for recourse for things like wage theft, not having passports confiscated, maintaining particular health and safety standards, having a minimum wage. So a number of the kinds of concerns that have been rightly raised in the past were being addressed. There are still questions, I think, important questions about whether these laws are just kind of changing in a structural way or whether we're actually seeing them being implemented. And so I think the actual practice on the ground still leaves a lot to be desired, especially when we think about some of the more recent reports having to do with wage theft and some workers that are still protesting those conditions and some of the fallout from those incidents. But I do think, again, it's a difficult question on the one hand because there are serious concerns that are being raised, and yet the campaign to deal with some of these issues or to raise these questions have often relied so much on hyperbolic statements, on inaccurate facts that I think actually hurt dealing with this issue more than it helps. And of course, because there is still a tinge of kind of Orientalism and even outright racism in some of the way that these issues are being raised, especially kind of in the international media, that also doesn't look at the total picture, right? That doesn't see this as purely, that sees this purely as a Qatar problem as opposed to a problem of the governance of international labor flows, and sees it as a problem of all of the firms that are implicated in this, that are trying to ultimately watch their bottom lines and exploit the low salaries that are given to workers, or see it as a problem with some of the other kind of intermediary actors and sort of just leaving it, I think, at the foot of just one state or government or even governing body is not sufficient when we're kind of thinking about all of the other complicit actors in the question of migrant labor. But again, I would say this chapter, I think, does a really excellent job of contextualizing this, offering, what are some of the remedies that have been there, and obviously opening more questions about what needs to be done in the future, long after the World Cup, and everyone sort of forgets about this issue. Are we going to still see the same kind of determination and commitment to trying to seek changes to the migrant labor governance structures here and across this region?
Very quickly here, who are the teams from the Middle East and the Islamic world that are competing?
Well, obviously Qatar is the host nation. There's Tunisia, Morocco are present, Iran as well. And so, I think there's certainly a tinge of sadness for the fact that Egypt and Algeria could not qualify in the end, given the large numbers of supporters that they have both within Qatar, but also regionally. But
And
certainly those
Saudi Arabia also, right?
and Saudi Arabia as well, of course, right next door.
Okay.
In fact, they might be one of the biggest fan groups. I mean, from what I've seen, the Saudi Arabia versus Argentina match is the hottest selling ticket so far from every match in the group stage.
All right. And who are you rooting for?
I'm rooting for good football, and I want to see some underdogs win. It'd be nice to see countries from this region definitely leave the claim, and I think it'd be nice to see a non-European champion, because they've won. It's been 20 years since we've seen a country not from Europe win the tournament. So seeing Brazil shine will obviously be fun, but also seeing countries from Asia and Africa do well, I think will be great for the region and for the future of the game.
So we also have a few African Muslim countries, right? Like Senegal.
Yeah, Senegal, Ghana. There's there's definitely I think an important presence from within the global South for sure.
Thank you so much, Abdullah, for taking the time and speaking with us. Awais.
Thank you so much, Abdullah, for your insights and sharing with us this really, I would say, cutting edge piece of work, which I know has been a very, these kinds of topics which don't have a lot of, literature already out there. It requires this kind of conversation to begin, right? To like introduce all of us to all the different kinds of issues that it touches on. And I think the volume does a great job doing that. So once again, congratulations on the volume. And thank you for your presence and your comments. We will have the next seminar on Iran, challenges external and internal, on November 3rd, Wednesday. I invite everybody who's currently listening to join us on November 3rd. And from here in Istanbul and at CIGA, I wish you a wonderful evening. And once again, thank you, Dr. Abdullah Al-Arian, for your kind participation.
Thank you so much for having